Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to the Drill Down. Well, Donald Trump has deployed troops to Washington, D.C. We may have a socialist mayor, and war continues to rage in the Middle East. What do they all have in common? They involve the either use or abuse of power. And we're going to talk today with the one and only Mark Levin about those topics and more as it relates to his new book. We're going to do that, of course, with the co-host of this program, Eric Eggers. Eric, how are you?
I'm excellent, Peter. I'm excited for you. I'm excited for our audience because today is one of the best times of your life. You get to host a show, talk to one of your favorite people in the world, who is Mark Levin, but you get to do your favorite thing, which is hold up a physical copy of someone else's book. Like, nothing brings Peter Schweizer more joy than to do that. So I'm just excited to see you do that as the professional that you are.
Well, the other joy that I get is as an author, as a writer, Mark is one of those people who actually writes his own books. There are a lot of celebrities, a lot of big names out there that pawn it off on somebody else. Mark actually writes his own book. So, Mark, we appreciate you joining us. The topic, of course, is the book is On Power. It's terrifically well received. You're number one on the New York Times bestseller list. Thanks again for joining us on this podcast.
It's a great pleasure. It's a great honor. I want to thank Linda behind the scenes, the invisible lady there, and you guys. It's a great pleasure. You know, Peter, I had to make a decision. I had two ideas for a book. On power and on drugs. But since I don't take drugs, I decided to write on power. So there you go.
Well, I think you made the right choice. You also wrote this book in an interesting way. Eric and I were talking about this earlier, and Eric joked that if he were in your situation, basically in a hospital bed for 2 months, which is when you took the time to write this book, Eric instead would have probably been watching Netflix and doing other stuff. But tell us about...
I literally would have been on drugs, actually. I would have gone with the other title.
Right. But so tell us about why you wrote the book. And what I think is so important about it is it provides sort of a prism or a lens by which you can look at a whole host of issues that we are facing today when it comes to the use of power.
Well, you're right. You know, the nerdy side of me, I'm staring at the ceiling for a couple of months because I can't get out of bed. And I'm thinking about things. I'm thinking about, believe it or not, the revolution and that whole period. And I thought to myself, maybe I'm not really focusing on the right part of this thing. We focus on liberty and unalienable rights and what the Declaration says. But what is the Declaration really saying? And so I decided to dig into this. And what they're really saying and what the revolution was really fought over was power. Who gets to make decisions about what? And I started to think about that. And then I realized, well, liberty without rights it means nothing. And rights without power mean nothing. They're all theories. So what are we battling over every day? We're battling over power. Who gets to make these decisions? Now, we believe in liberty and we believe in unalienable rights. And as a matter of fact, the founders of our Constitution at the Second Continental Congress, when they came up with the idea of a declaration, and when Jefferson wrote the first draft, they believed that God was the sovereign. They embraced the Judeo-Christian belief system. That doesn't mean everyone in this country has to embrace it, but they need to understand that our country was based on this. And then they decided, okay, great, now how do we apply this to our country? And so the way they applied it during the constitutional period is they fused it with the Enlightenment. And how do we know that? Because they told us. Montesquieu is mentioned several times in the Federalist Papers, and he was the one that really fine-tuned this idea of power checking power. And that was the key to them, because even though man is the sovereign on earth, as the children of God, government, we're the sovereign, not government, not the people who run it. They also knew that man is a dark side, that man is imperfect. The Bible says so. God has said so. So how do we deal with that? Well, we recognize that man is sovereign. We, each of us individually, we as part of the civil society, as Locke talked about, but we also have to contain that through power. So I said, okay, well, power can be used for bad. We'll get to that later. Power can be used for good. The Constitution balances power, power against power. And so I said, let's see. So there's positive power and there's negative power. And so I write about negative power and I write about positive power and the difference between the two, and I apply it to modern day Marxism, Islamism versus Americanism. And then I go back to look for definitions through history. What would the framers and the founders have looked at? They looked at the ancients and so forth. So you'll see a little spattering of Aristotle in there, and Cicero in there. And again, you'll find the Enlightenment, Locke, Montesquieu, and others in there. So that's what I was thinking about when I tore my tendon 100%, was standing at the ceiling, and I needed a wheelchair just to get to the restroom. That's the sort of thing I was thinking of.
Mm. Yeah, it's a journey. And, it's funny on the one hand, Mark, it's like, hey, you've written a successful writer, successful radio career. I'm like, I could be interviewing myself. But but it turns out after reading this book that we're very different, because you're referencing Montesquieu and John Locke and the Stalin Constitution, and you're going places and pulling in things that I think people don't see kind of anywhere. And what I love is how you connect it to real world concepts. And you just talked about negative power and positive power. And I was telling Peter, one of, I think, the most relevant and interesting applications of that concept is when you write, you say, you talk about the judicial interventions, and you say there's this clash between the tyrannical exercise of negative power by the judiciary, the unelected and unrepresented body, and the constitutional exercise of positive power by the president. I thought it was really interesting to frame what the Trump administration is doing as an exercise in positive power, because some people would say, looking at this Trump presidency, with the number of executive orders and then the taking over the police in Washington, D.C., they would say that is too much. Why do you call the Trump administration an exercise in positive power?
Well, let's look at those two things. The revolution was fought over who makes what decisions, the far-off monarchy or the people. And these unelected judges, they're not even in the Constitution. The role of a judge is to be a referee, and that's it. And I explained early in our history in 1803 with the Marbury versus Madison decision, Chief Justice of the United States Marshal, who'd been the Secretary of State under John Adams, and we had a long period of a lame duck period back then between November and March. They decided to grab power, even though they lost the election. They lost the presidency, they lost the House, they lost the Senate, they lost everything. And so Adams appoints his Secretary of State to be the Chief Justice of the United States. He's a distant cousin of Jefferson. They literally hate each other's guts. They have different viewpoints. And here comes this decision, Marbury versus Madison. And what does Marshall decide? He decides, hey, we the court, we have the final say about the Constitution. And Jefferson says, the hell are you talking about? You lost the election. This guy was a hack. Now he's the Chief Justice. Here I am, President of the United States, and you're going to tell me what the Constitution says? That for another day, but I point that out. So to answer your question, what the courts are doing, you can oppose Donald Trump's executive orders. Congress has a way to deal with that. The Supreme Court can, in fact, deal with that if they think he's out of his lane and so forth and so on. But that's really not what's happening. What's happening is the Democrat Party, out of power, they have a whole strategy in place. Their attorneys general, their unions and all the rest, their ethnic front groups, on how they're going to bring cases, to whom they're going to bring cases, national injunctions, national temporary restraining orders. This is judicial tyranny completely out of control. Donald Trump's executive orders can be overturned by another president. These judicial rulings are intended to be binding forever until another court overturns them. That's a big problem. Then on the issue of Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. is a federal city. Whatever power the locals have was given to them by Congress. And so they tried home rule. It began in the 70s with Nixon in the Congress, and they have an extremely radical council. They have a very incompetent mayor. It is a one-party city. Trump's looking at this. He's saying under federal law, I have the power for 30 days, and then we can fight to extend it to control the police force there. I have the authority over the National Guard. I will back up the police force with the National Guard. We're going to put an end to crime here. You have interns being killed. You have other people being attacked outside the Capitol building. People do not walk in Washington, D.C. at night. They don't do it. They don't do it around the monuments, the Capitol, the Convention Center, even around the White House, where there's 4 billion police officers and Secret Service. And he said, we're not going to do this. We're going to fix this. And he has every right to do it. Congress has every right to do it. And they'll decide who has the power to do what. But this local government is local because Congress allowed it to exist, not because the rest of the country, it's the bottom up. You know, the towns came first, the colonies, then the states came next, and they created the national government. The national government created the District of Columbia. So back to your point, positive and negative power. That's just the exercise of legitimate constitutional authority by the President of the United States, even though the left doesn't like it. That's their problem. And the courts out of control, judicial tyranny. I even write about the state of Israel, which I also love, how they've turned into a judicial tyranny, which they have, because the judiciary is completely out of control. To put a fine point on this, when you have a judiciary out of control, when you have a massive bureaucracy that is not in the Constitution, and they place this bureaucracy, which is basically a massive legislature, but without the benefit of the people voting or representation, and they stick it in the executive branch, and then they tell the executive branch, you have no authority over this branch that we created and stuck in the executive branch that's making laws. You have no authority over the personnel. You have no authority over policy, which is what these judges did. My point is you have a complete collapse of the constitutional system and separation of powers. And I also explain in the book, I'm sorry, I'm filibustering a little bit, but I really get into this, that Woodrow Wilson, this was his dream. It was the dream of a communist named Gramsci, who I don't get into this book, in a prior book, who said Marx was wrong. This revolution doesn't come from the bottom up, the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. It has to be imposed on America. It has to be the top down. And we do that through empowering the judges who are unelected, so we don't have to sweat the elections. And we do it through this massive bureaucracy that we're going to create. And slowly but surely, through this system, top-down centralized power and government, we will impose the communist revolution. That's exactly what they're doing. I know that's a long way. That's all negative power, all negative power.
Well, I think one of the things you do so well in the book as well, Mark, is you not only talk about the authority where it resides in terms of taking action, but you also talk about ordered liberty. And this seems to me one of the odd things of the left right now. They loved Joe Biden's executive orders, even if they weren't constitutional within his authority, but they don't like Trump's. And I think the point that you make in the book that's so important is, you know, you've got the authoritarians on the one hand, and then you've got maybe the anarchists and the libertarians on the other. They don't really want any centralized power. The genius of the founders was you need to have some central authority that needs to be checked. There needs to be competition between the various branches, but the goal is ordered liberty. Talk about ordered liberty in the context of what Trump is trying to do when it comes to law enforcement in the District of Columbia and some of the other areas in which he's exercised executive authority.
First of all, I've done 100 interviews. You guys are doing a great job, if I may say.
We needed that so badly. Thank you so much.
I'm here for you. Never forget it. I have a chapter on liberty, and I'll tell you what's interesting. John Stuart Mill is considered the great libertarian when it comes to liberty. He wrote a book called On Liberty. I went back and read that book again, and I critique it a little bit in my new book, On Power. And what's interesting in my liberty chapter is he goes on about liberty, what it is, pretty good definitions. And then at the very end, he says, but you need law. You need these things in order to make a determination on what kind of liberty you're going to have. So in other words, as an example, I have liberty, but does that mean I can prevent somebody else from having liberty? Yes, I can. So who's going to make a decision on how we control that? Who's going to make a decision on what liberty is okay? These are complicated words, complicated terms, much more than people think. I looked at Aristotle, who talks about liberty, but never really defines it. I look at John Stuart Mill. At the very end of the book, he finally says, well, you need some kind of order. You need some kind of law. You need something. I think even most libertarians would agree with it. But then the question is, what? And he doesn't tell us. He doesn't tell us. You have Samuel Adams, one of the leaders, one of the earliest leaders of the American Revolution, writes a long essay on liberty. and mentions it many times. And then you're finished, you say, okay, but he doesn't define liberty. Jefferson does probably the best job at defining liberty. But I conclude in the book, liberty is one of those words that is defined by what it's not rather than what it is, because there's just so many permutations to the word. And of course, you know it when you see it, you know, that old Justice Stewart line about pornography and so forth. But it's very important to defend. And one of the things I mentioned in the book, to your point, is the difficulty with liberty. And man has never figured out how to deal with this and never will. It's a puzzle. Liberty gives people who oppose liberty, evil people, the freedom to destroy it. They do. Liberty does. And so you have a guy like Mondami who will destroy the city and destroy liberty by using the vote, little d democracy, and liberty. And this is the problem that folks like us and most of your viewers and listeners have, which is we want liberty. We want ordered liberty. But how do we prevent evil people from taking advantage of it, expanding their liberty and their power by destroying ours? And I try to discuss this. It's not easily mentioned, but I try to discuss this in the book. And I tried to write the book where it's almost like a story where you go through each piece of it, where they connect up. It was very complicated to write this book, but I tried to put it in plain English. But I bring in some of the smartest people who ever lived here and there. And then I try myself to use my own reasoning and logic to explain these things, which is why I break down the word power into a couple different types, and which is why I have these chapters on language, thought control, liberty, and rights. I don't even know if I answered your question, to be honest with you, but there you go.
No, you did. You did great. And that's the key thing. Like it said, liberty is, we know what it is, but it's hard to define.
I think he was looking for some affirmation on his answer as he gave to us with our asking the questions. Mark, you're doing great. I just want to say, I don't know.
You're a good man no matter what they say, Eric.
You're doing a great job. Actually, and it's interesting. So in doing some research about you, I didn't realize that I see the Eagles hat, and I didn't realize that you were from the Philadelphia area. And I also didn't realize that you won election to the school board when you were 19 years old and worked to lower property taxes. And I think it's interesting to compare or to think about this idea of power and liberty and how like people like Mamdani might try to use their liberty to constrain ours. And property taxes is one of the ways that they might do that, because a lot of people have raised the point that you will never truly be free to own your own home if the government has liberty to take it if you don't pay your property taxes. We live in Florida. This has been an issue. Ron DeSantis talks about this. Marco Rubio, when he was Speaker of the House, actually 20 years ago tried to pass a bill that would have eliminated property taxes in Florida and kind of replaced it with sales tax. But I guess, do you think about property taxes like back to the beginning of your political kind of ascension and how property taxes plays into some of these ideas?
Yeah, I mean, people lost their homes, and DeSantis makes the great point that you pay your mortgage off, but you're still paying a mortgage. You're still paying it to the government, and if you don't keep paying that every month, it doesn't matter what your income is. It doesn't matter if it's affordable. You spent your whole life living in that house. All kinds of people move in. The property values go up. People say, isn't that great? No, I want to live in my house. I don't want to sell my house. It's great if you want to sell it, but not if you want to live in it. I see that happening even where I live right now. We have billionaires moving in from New York, which is perfectly fine, but they knock down whatever's there. They'll take 2 lots. Doesn't matter if you live back a ways, right on the ocean. They'll build it up, and then all of a sudden the town comes in because it enriches the town. They're there, oh, wow. We don't have to raise taxes because the millage is the same. Yes, they're raising taxes, and the impact is enormous. And now where's that money go? Everywhere I've lived, as you know, I was on this school board, about 78% on the dollar, it could be 75, it could be 80 cents, goes to the school system. And about 80% of every one of those dollars goes to the teachers' unions, the teachers. And so you're basically owning this home, and you're not spending so much on cops and firefighters and water and the youth. You're spending it on the school system. That's what you're spending it on, the government school system. And if you don't pay it, you're going to lose your home. Or if you send your kids to parochial school or a different type of religious school, or you homeschool them or whatever, you have to pay it no matter what. If you're 87 years old and you're living on food stamps and Social Security, you better pay that tax or you're going to lose your home. So to answer your question, yes, this is something that bothered me, because what is not well known, and nor should it be, I guess, is I got elected when I was 19 because I created an organization called the Committee for Tax Limitation. I started a Tea Party revolt in my township before anybody heard of a Tea Party revolt. And a newspaper called the Philadelphia Bulletin, which doesn't exist anymore, was a big paper, used to do stories on me as this Tea Party leader in Cheltenham Township, with a population of about 40,000, 38,000. Here's this kid. And I went door to door. I campaigned on this issue. The Republican Party in that town was very powerful at the time. Now it's all Democrat, of course. And they were scared to death of me. And there was a Tea Party revolt in the township. And the party leaders begged me to campaign for them and with them in their parts of the township. So I did. Because they would wind up supporting my view. So in any way, long story short, yes, property taxes are a big thing for me. This book really is an evergreen book. This book could affect how you think of property taxes. It can affect how you think of Congress and the courts. But I want people to think this way. That is, when politicians are making decisions, you need to decide, gee, do I want money? No. What power are they exercising? Are they exercising it legitimately? And are they stealing your sovereign power? And that's what the revolution was about, protecting your sovereign power and the sovereign power of your community. I know people don't think of things this way, but let's look at Mondami. Let's look at New York City. He wants to take all the power you have in deciding what you're going to eat, how much you're going to pay for it, where you're going to go. That's what control the grocery stores mean. He says he wants to control private housing market. Well, what does that mean? That means when you're a Marxist, you're going to redistribute who can live where, what kind of housing you can have, and so forth. And so, in other words, you're going to have a 33-year-old punk, sort of a domestic Castro, I think that was about his age, who has done nothing in his life, who came into this country when he was a teenager from Uganda, whose family is very wealthy and very radical Marxist Islamist, making these decisions for you. So you as an adult, you're not going to have authority over yourself. You're not going to have authority over your decisions. Some jerk's going to be making these decisions for you. And you need to realize this and understand this.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, one of the really important elements of your book, Mark. It's not just looking at American history. It's looking at the issues we face today through a very particular lens. And one of the ways in which you do that, I thought it was a terrific idea, is you actually quote from Stalin's Constitution. And when you look at this document, if you read this document not knowing anything about Joseph Stalin, not understanding the history of liberty, not fully understanding human nature, you read this stuff and think, oh, this seems pretty good. And, you know, in a way, the current mayoral candidate, Mamdani, could have actually run and maybe is running on Stalin's Constitution. So explain how people should digest information they're told by elected officials of the media, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. How can they guard themselves and the country when politicians come making promises?
This is the great point that you make, and this is why I put quotes from Stalin's 1936 Constitution. And the next year, he was busy wiping out the Ukrainians, millions of them. And everything he said in that Constitution was a lie. Maybe the greatest Constitution ever written, except for a couple of things. It doesn't divide power against power. And I talked about rights. You need to have power, the right kind of power. Well, nobody had power except Stalin. So he could write whatever he wants. He could control the language. He could put it out there to create the impression that he's the greatest, civil libertarian on the face of the earth while he's slaughtering people left and right. And I did this for a purpose because FDR plagiarized from Stalin's Constitution. He wrote the Second Bill of Rights, which law professors all over the country love and promote, which does the same thing. We're going to provide you, from birth to death, all these wonderful things and so forth. We have professors that have written books about the Second Bill of Rights. And I have attacked the Second Bill of Rights aggressively. And I've said, well, what does it mean? It means you just lost your liberty. Now, I tell people also, compare something with something. Don't compare something with an ideology. Because this is what these Marxists, this is what guys like Sanders do, and Mandami and the rest of them. Human beings are imperfect. Our institutions are imperfect. What these people do, what the Marxists do, and the Islamists do, is they exploit it. They say, see that person's suffering. See that person can't eat. See that person is this. Look what we're offering you. The moon. And I say, oh, well, wait a minute. Now, we're going to compare that with what you people actually do and have done since really the late 1800s. All the people you've slaughtered, all the people who are starving, all the people who are going hungry. So compare the United States to communist China and how they treat their people. Compare the United States to North Korea. Compare the United States to Cuba. Compare the United States to Nicaragua, to Venezuela. Something with something, not something with nothing. And then I say, folks, you should take a little bit of inventory. You walk into a supermarket, you can pick any kind of meat and fowl and fish and wine and soda that you want. So many types of bread, you don't even know what bread to select. Butter and margarine and this with oil and that with almonds, and it goes on and on and on. What do you think created that? Government? No. This hated capitalism created that, which is a word Marx invented. It was just considered commercial volunteerism. But that's okay. I'll take the word. I like it. Capitalism created that, not socialism. And guess what? 150 years ago, not a single king or queen lived, ate as well as the American middle class. The American middle class is better off today than kings and queens ever were, better off than Mao was, better off than Stalin was, better off than Cicero was, better off than Caesar was. Think about it. The common man in America, electricians and plumbers and taxi drivers, truck drivers, live better today. You hit a switch, the lights come on. You turn on the faucet, you get clean, hot and cold water. You got a toilet in your house. You want to go somewhere, you get in a car. It could be a used car. Almost every American has a car. You go. You want to fly across country? Think about that. We complain about the space we're in and whether we're eating pretzels or peanuts. We're flying across the country 40,000 feet in the air in an air-conditioned plane. This is what America has brought. This is what capitalism has brought. This is what power properly applied has brought. The other side brings nothing.
I want to be very clear. Peter doesn't complain about peanuts or pretzels on airplanes. I complain about too many people being in line so I can get into the nicer place with better snacks. But that is, again, a byproduct of capitalism.
It's a good point.
So you're amazing, and this is terrific. And we did, people, I think they can read your books, they can watch you on TV, they can listen to you on the radio. A thing they might not know about you, though, is that among the many books you have written, one is called Rescuing Sprite, and that is about your love for animals. And so we did, we both love animals here. We were just curious, number one, how many animals are currently in your home? And so how many dogs do you have rolling around the Levin household today?
We have 2 and sometimes 3 when my stepdaughter, who is a heart doctor, when she has these crazy hours. So we have sometimes 3, and they are all just fantastic. And we get them at the, what do they call them? Not the pound, whatever they call them.
The shelter.
What's that?
The shelter.
The shelters. I'm sorry, the shelters. And honestly, that's where I donate most of my money, to dog shelters. That's
beautiful. I mean, I think
when I donate, yeah.
Well, you have the freedom to donate.
Every year, what I'm trying to say is every year we make donations. The biggest donations I make are to the local dog shelter.
It's terrific.
That's terrific.
It's terrific. So the question we had, Mark, is, and this was Eric's thought, is, of course, you wrote the famous book about your dog Sprite, The question is now with RFK, with the Maha movement, would you name a new dog Sprite, or would you pick something that is more Maha oriented?
Like, can you even name dogs after soda anymore? And what about that level of liberty?
Well, you make a great point. You know what's funny about processed foods? Do we have a minute here? At the turn of the last century, processed foods, that was a genius invention because there wasn't enough fresh food to go around. The cities, New York, people were dying. They didn't have freezer systems. They didn't have refrigerator systems. They didn't have a way to keep meat fresh. So people were eating rancid meat. It's how Heinz came into being. He was trying to figure out some kind of sauce to put on rancid meat. He came up with ketchup after he went bankrupt, and he put his house up. He mortgaged his house twice. So processed foods was a way of feeding the people. And even now, when you look at fast food restaurants, even though the prices are through the roof thanks to Biden and the rest, it's a way that people can afford to eat. So while we sit around and we talk about, let's get rid of all the processed foods, and why do we have colors in M&Ms and all the rest, and, it's causing this, it's causing that, I don't disagree with some of that. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, people didn't invent processed foods just because they want to kill people and make a buck. There was a need to make processed foods to feed the population. The cities, right, at the turn of the last century were becoming overwhelmed with people. You had all these I won't call them slums, but tenements and so forth and so on. They needed to eat, and there wasn't enough food. Certainly wasn't enough fresh food. I will say that if they succeed completely, the price of food is going to go way up. Because when you want fresh vegetables and fruits and meat and that sort of thing, that's what's going to happen. But I'm not against limiting some of this if that's what they want to do. Me, I don't really give a damn. I'll make a choice. Do I want to eat processed food? Or do I want to, eat, people love this other stuff. I think it's crap for the most part, but that's okay. If they want to eat a lot of vegetables, go for it. But we get a choice in America right now, if you really think about it. People don't have to buy cereal that has all different colors, Fruit Loops or whatever. So I'm not into the let's make this illegal game. I'm not into let's only eat stuff that's transparent or translucent. That's fine if people want to do that. In other words, I say to my wife, I don't want to go into the part of the supermarket where all the hippies are, and all the vegans are. It's over there. If I go to a big supermarket, I'm on the other side. I'm on the side where the bakery is and all the rest of it. But if people want to eat that way, that's fine by me. It's just that I don't necessarily want to do that.
Yeah. Well, it is absolutely free country. You are free to eat what you want, even if it's the equivalent of grass.
And free to avoid the hippies at the grocery store.
That too as well. We were talking to Mark Levin about his terrific new book on power. Just in closing, Mark, I want to, and it's not a central focus of your book. Your focus is on power with a lot of focus on the United States. But I want to talk about the Middle East for a second, because you can apply the lens that you have on power, on the use and abuse of power, positive power, negative power, to the struggle going on in the Middle East right now. And there's so much moral equivalence in the reporting that you see between Hamas, this terrorist organization, and the Israel government. Give people just a couple of thoughts on why this is not a struggle between two powers. This is really a struggle between Western civilization in terms of the state of Israel and this sort of barbaric movement of Hamas that wants to abuse not only its people, but the people of Israel.
I spent a lot of time in this book talking about Islamism, and that Islamism and Marxism have many similarities. They both hate the West. Marx despised the West. He despised the notion of free will and individualism. He thought it was selfish. He despised the Judeo-Christian belief system. He said it's mysticism. It gets into the way of human progress. He thought the Constitution, ours, was a joke. It was pathetic to have all these people fighting with each other. Islamism, notice I'm not talking about Muslims, period. I'm talking about Islamism, but it is a big part of that faith. Has a similar viewpoint. They hate the West. Just read their scholars. They'll tell you. They're scholars who breed this terrorism. They They don't believe in power checking power. They reject the Enlightenment. Their ideology is primitive. It's back in the 7th century. Their conduct is barbaric. They slaughter more Muslims than anybody else slaughters Muslims. It's appalling. If you don't agree with their viewpoint, it doesn't matter if you're a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, or nobody. You have to be removed. You have to be eliminated if you don't convert, and convert convincingly so. Same with Marxism. If you get in the way of the pursuit of the people's paradise, the workers' paradise, you have to be eliminated too. And remember, they dehumanize the individual. So they don't view Jews as human beings, or Christians as human beings, or Westerners as human beings. And so that is the battle. These ideologies, Marxism and Islamism, are utterly incompatible with Americanism. And yet, some of the early scholars, again, terrorists, were talking about what I call revolution by immigration. That is, the exportation of their ideology through the exportation of large numbers of people into Europe and into the United States. That's exactly what's happening. And the West can be very weak. And in Europe, the West is very weak. In the United States, we have Donald Trump, who's very strong. But I fear if we had most other types of Republicans, and certainly a guy like Biden or Obama or whatever, we're very weak. And open borders denudes our belief system, our culture. We seem to be assimilating more into other cultures than they seem to be assimilating into us. And that's by design in these public schools and in our universities and colleges. I think what's concerning me most, and what I'm speaking out against very loudly and aggressively, is a movement, not so much in the Republican Party, but in the radical right. See, I view the political spectrum this way. So if you're a constitutional conservative, you're at the bottom of the center. The Constitution is not right-wing or left-wing. It's America. It's the core of Americanism. So how can you be a right-winger if you believe in the text of the Constitution or the original intent? You're not. That's the left calling us right-wingers. But there are right-wingers. And so people talk about the horseshoe. I'm pretty close to that. My view is at the top, you've got fascists, neo-Nazis, Nazis, Klansmen. And at the top, you also have Marxists and people of that ilk and so forth. And there's more overlay there than people understand. There's no overlay with you and me and them. But when I hear people self-identifying as influencers because they have a podcast, and maybe they have millions of listeners or hits or eyes or whatever they have, or they have a subscription-based service and they have several hundreds of thousands, and they want to drive the agenda. They don't drive the agenda. They drive a small niche. They're in a relatively small lane, big fish in a small pool, we used to talk about. Maybe they're that, but they're becoming so extreme, many of them, that now they sound like the radical left. They sound like the Marxists and the Islamists. Israel is trying to survive. Israel wants their hostages back. They want to eliminate Hamas. Hamas is known to be starving its own people. Hamas, even the UN reported the other day that 88% of its trucks are being hijacked. 88%. The Israelis are saying, we keep sending food in there. We've sent enough food in there to feed 2.5 million people multiple times, but they keep stealing at Hamas. They consume it and then they sell it in order to remilitarize and in order to pay more Palestinians to join their terrorist movement. Everybody knows this is going on. Even the New York Times with its phony photo. Why do you need a phony photo if there's massive starvation going on? Just take the pictures. You see those pictures from the Holocaust? Nobody had a phony photo. All you had to do, everywhere you turned, people were starving. And that kid's dying from a horrific disease. And guess what? They didn't report. It's the Israelis who facilitated him. I think he went either to Italy or Jordan for treatment, and they couldn't do anything for him. He comes back. His brother's well-fed. His mother's a little zaftig, as we say. There she's standing. And you think to yourselves, what's happening here is the anti-Semitism and the Jew hatred is so massive now that even in the 30s with the rise of Germany and so forth, there were Western countries that pushed back. There's fewer and fewer Western countries pushing back. President Trump is pushing back. Britain's not pushing back. France isn't pushing back. Australia's not. Canada's not. It's like, wow. It's actually quite frightening that people are defending. Negative power is sort of a surgical way to put it. But true evil against people who are trying to survive, they're going after the Israelis the way they'll go after us if they can. They're going after the Jews the way they already went after the Christians. How many Christians are there in the Middle East now? How many Christians are left in Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus? It's now 20% Christian. The Palestinians have pushed the Christians out. They run for their lives. How many Christians are there? I mean, think about it. In Syria, well, they're killing them. How many Christians are left in Iraq? They're killing them. How many Christians are left in Iran? Same thing. Same with the entire Middle East. You have the Coptic Christians in Egypt. They are abused. They are discriminated against. They're scared to death for their lives and so forth. That is the birthplace of Judaism. It was then the birthplace of Christianity. The last of the three religions is Islam. How is it that all these countries, and virtually that entire region, must be 95% Islam? Where did all the Christians go? So the Jews have this one state. They have a tiny country. Look at the size of Saudi Arabia and Egypt and these other countries. And what do they say? That belongs to us. No, it doesn't belong to you. Here's the Bible. We don't believe in the Bible. Well, too bad. And so it's really horrendous. And let me add one other point. You brought this up. Does anybody really believe if there was a Palestinian state, there would be peace? The problem was there was a Palestinian state, and there wasn't peace. In Syria, almost 600,000 people were slaughtered in a civil war between Muslims. Slaughtered. In Yemen today, 250,000 people have been killed or starved to death. Muslims against Muslims. In Africa, the Islamists are killing the black Christians in at least a dozen African states. Nobody talks about that. Nobody looks at Syria and says, well, I guess another state or another country may not fix this problem. Jordan is 70% Palestinian. The king is not Palestinian. His wife, the queen, is Palestinian. He wants nothing to do with more Palestinians. Why? Because they tried to overthrow his father, the king. And what did he do about it? He killed them. And he imprisoned them. That's what he did about it. And he still imprisons his Palestinian opposition. What about the communist Chinese, our good friends? The Uyghurs, 2.5 million Uyghurs are in concentration camps, raped, tortured, and murdered. So why is it that Britain focuses on Israel? Why is it that France focuses on Israel? Why is it that the UN focuses on Israel? You can say this for Hamas. They know how to play the West better than any entity I've ever seen in my life. That's my long answer to your question.
Well, it's the right answer. And yeah, they play the West. They play on Western guilt. And I think that's why it's important for people to pick up a copy of the book On Power by Mark Levin. He dissects how power is used and how power is abused. And to your point about the influencers, look, you've got to have a lens by which you assess what people are saying. Just don't pay attention to them because they're famous personalities or they have an audience. Actually distill and dissect what they're saying. Eric, your final thoughts.
Well, to that point, you talked about them being maybe in a small lane. You do wonder how many of those influencers on the right wing are attempting to stake out a position in an effort. How much of it is sincere ideological alignment? How much of it is they're just trying to grow their lane and they will get more attention?
Be controversial.
Be controversial, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Mark, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us. We appreciate you working and writing this book. And we appreciate you, the audience, for tuning in as always. You can find out more about the research we do at thedrilldown.com. And we ask that you please subscribe to the podcast. Thanks again. Until next time.